Most people think they know who they're messing with until the truth hits harder than a fist. When a grizzled biker gang rolled into a small-town diner looking for trouble, they thought the quiet cook behind the counter would be an easy target. What they didn't know was that she had been trained by the best, and her late father's legacy was about to turn the tables in a way no one saw coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning haze still clung to the narrow streets of Grayson Hollow, a town tucked so deep in the Appalachian Range that even GPS signals hesitated before reaching it. The diner, a creaky silver box from the 50s that stood stubbornly at the corner of Main and Ash, had just begun to fill with its usual weekday regulars. The bell above the entrance gave a cheerful jingle every time someone walked in, though most of the town's early risers were already in place. The retired postman with his crossword puzzle, the 2 factory workers fueling up before the late shift, and the mayor's wife sipping her black coffee while reading local headlines no one outside of Grayson Hollow cared about. Behind the counter, Anna Morgan moved with quiet precision. Her auburn hair was tucked into a loose braid, her sleeves rolled up to reveal calloused forearms earned through long shifts and longer nights. She wore the kind of calm that made her almost invisible, efficient, unbothered, and pleasant in a way that discouraged questions. No one knew where she'd come from exactly. Some said she moved from Tennessee, others guessed North Carolina. What was known was that she'd been working at May's Diner for nearly 4 years, living in a tiny 1-bedroom above the hardware store. And she never missed a single shift. Customers liked her. She never overcooked the eggs, didn't talk too much, and always remembered how you took your coffee. On that particular Tuesday, the sun had just started burning through the mist when the quiet of the town was cracked open by the growl of engines. 3 motorcycles roared down Main Street like they owned the pavement, drawing the attention of every window and open door. Chrome gleamed in the light, and leather vests fluttered in the wind like dark flags of warning. The locals froze. Outsiders weren't rare in Grayson Hollow, but ones like these, tattooed, scarred, mean-eyed, set off every instinct that the town had developed over decades of learning when to mind its business. The bikes skidded to a stop in front of May's. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the tallest of the 3 swung his leg off his machine and stomped up to the door, followed closely by the others. Inside, the air tightened. Silverware paused mid-air, conversations cut off mid-word. The bell jingled cheerfully as the door opened, completely oblivious to the change in atmosphere. They walked in like thunderclouds, boots heavy, eyes scanning every face with contempt and casual threat. Their leader, a barrel-chested man with a gray beard and arms like tree trunks, let his gaze rest on Anna as she stood behind the counter, pouring coffee. He smirked, the kind of smirk that had seen 100 bars and caused 1,000 regrets. Anna didn't flinch. She didn't smile either. She simply placed the pot down, wiped her hands on her apron, and met his stare. The room held its breath. The biker leaned in close enough to see the faint freckles across her cheeks. The cook, he thought, was cute, small, quiet, probably had no idea what kind of men she was dealing with. He barked out something about food, something that didn't quite mask the challenge beneath his tone. She answered plainly. He didn't like that. One of his buddies chuckled under his breath. The other pulled a toothpick from behind his ear and started chewing on it like this was just another town to bulldoze through. To the regulars, this moment stretched painfully. They'd seen movies where this kind of thing went sideways fast. A thrown plate, a broken bottle, a scream. They shifted nervously in their seats, unsure whether to leave, speak up, or pray that someone else would do something. But Anna? She just kept wiping the counter. Her eyes, steady and unreadable, never left the bikers. She didn't look scared. She looked like someone measuring something, weighing options, calculating distance. The biker mistook that for meekness. Most bullies do. He leaned further over the counter, spitting a lazy insult that no one would ever repeat. The room tensed. Anna didn't even blink. She turned around, walked into the kitchen, and returned with a plate of eggs and toast. His order, made without asking. She slid it in front of him, her expression unchanged. That was the first crack in his performance. She'd taken away his script. No fear, no sass, no begging, just efficiency. He wasn't sure how to react. But he would double down soon enough, because men like him always did. What he didn't realize, what none of them realized, was that they'd just tried to corner a woman who'd grown up around a different kind of fight, a different kind of warrior. Anna's father hadn't raised her to shout or retreat. He had trained her to read intention, stay composed, and, when necessary, end things before they even started. But that story hadn't been told yet. For now, all anyone saw was a quiet cook in a dusty town, and that's exactly how she liked it. Anna Morgan was the kind of woman people noticed only when they needed something done right the first time. In a town like Grayson Hollow, where word of mouth carried more weight than resumes or credentials, her name had slowly become shorthand for dependability. Not many knew her story, and she preferred it that way. She wasn't the type to fill silences with anecdotes or inflate her past to earn respect. Her respect came the old-fashioned way, earned through consistency, quiet strength, and a sharp eye that missed nothing. She stood at 5'7", wiry and agile rather than imposing, with arms strengthened by a life of physical labor. Her eyes were a steel gray that shifted to blue under the right light, and though her expression rarely betrayed emotion, there was a calm intensity to her gaze that left people unsure whether to confide in her or keep their distance. Most chose the latter. The local rumor mill had little to chew on when it came to her background. Some whispered about a failed marriage. Others said she'd moved here to escape a life in the city, maybe even the military. But she never confirmed or denied anything. She simply showed up to May's Diner before dawn every morning, prepared the prep station in meticulous order, and worked the line with a precision that made even the crankiest customers think twice about complaining. Her days were built on routines. Wake up at 4:30, 20 push-ups beside the bed before her first cup of coffee, oatmeal with flaxseed for breakfast, and then the short walk from her apartment to the diner. She rarely took days off and had only called in sick once in the past 2 years, and even then, she sent a text with a list of that day's specials, prep notes, and supplier reminders. To May, the diner's owner, Anna was a godsend. Reliable, unshakable, and drama-free. She never gossiped, never lingered after hours, and never brought personal baggage to the kitchen. But if May had looked closer, if anyone had, they might have seen that her unshakable calm came not from detachment, but from discipline. The kind of discipline that isn't learned in culinary school or small-town kitchens. Anna had learned it from her father, Commander Thomas Morgan, a Navy SEAL whose name was still spoken with reverence in certain military circles. Growing up in Virginia Beach, Anna had known early on that her family wasn't like others. While her friends learned to bake cookies with their moms and build tree houses with their dads, Anna was learning hand signals, survival tactics, and situational awareness. Her mother passed when she was 8, a quiet woman who had once worked as a cryptologist for the Navy before cancer stole her light. From then on, it had been just Anna and her father, two souls bound by grief, duty, and an understanding that strength wasn't just physical. Commander Morgan didn't raise Anna with softness, but he wasn't cruel. His version of love came through structure, expectations, and the belief that his daughter could handle more than anyone imagined. He taught her to box before she could legally drive, taught her to shoot a rifle before she ever learned to parallel park. But more than anything, he taught her how to think, how to assess people, environments, threats, how to anticipate before reacting. He told her that the world didn't owe her safety, so she had to make her own. That philosophy had been ingrained in her muscles, her bones, her breath. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When he died 5 years ago during a covert operation overseas, something inside her fractured, though no one would have known. She attended the military funeral with a composed face, accepted the folded flag with a steady hand, and never cried in public. The inheritance he left her wasn't much in money, but it included his journals, his medals, and a single note that read, "Remember what I taught you. It matters now more than ever." Anna didn't want a desk job. She didn't want to enlist either. She wanted silence. She wanted space. Grayson Hollow was a blip on the map, a place no one would think to look for a seal's daughter. That was its appeal. She could disappear in routine, in the hiss of the griddle and the clatter of plates. She could take what her father taught her and bury it under pancake batter and steaming mugs of black coffee. But hiding strength doesn't mean it goes away. It just waits. And in Anna's case, it waited behind every measured breath, every observant glance, every decision to let others underestimate her. She knew what she was capable of, but she never used it unless there was no other choice. That morning, when the bikers walked in, she'd immediately clocked the tension in the air, the way her regulars stiffened, the subtle shift in energy that came when predatory eyes scanned a room looking for weakness. She knew the types, men who believed power came from intimidation, from volume, from brute force. Her father had dealt with those men in combat zones. Anna had learned to disarm them with silence. The town saw a cook with a calm demeanor. The bikers saw a woman alone behind a counter. But what they didn't realize was that she'd been trained by a man who specialized in eliminating threats long before they became problems. That kind of training doesn't dull over time. It doesn't vanish with grief. It simmers, always ready. And on this particular day, it would be tested more than it had in years. Grayson Hollow was the kind of town people passed through without ever really seeing. It sat between two slow highways and three aging hills, nestled like a forgotten thought between more important places. The population hovered just under 4,000 on paper, but anyone who lived there would tell you that only about 500 really stayed year-round. The rest were either old names etched in tombstones or ghosts clinging to boarded-up storefronts. Time didn't move fast in Grayson Hollow. It ambled. Buildings that had been standing since the 60s still wore the same paint, now peeled and faded by the mountain sun. Power lines crisscrossed the sky like forgotten spiderwebs, and the scent of pine, motor oil, and frying bacon hung thick in the air most mornings. The heart of the town was its single main street, lined with a barber shop, a hardware store, a thrift shop, and at the corner, May's Diner, a squat aluminum building with chipped red trim and a neon sign that buzzed more than it glowed. That diner was the pulse of the town, more consistent than the mayor, more reliable than the weather. May's Diner opened at 5 every morning and closed promptly at 3 in the afternoon. It didn't serve dinner, didn't take reservations, and didn't have Wi-Fi, and the folks of Grayson Hollow wouldn't have it any other way. Its vinyl booths were worn from decades of elbows and stories, and the checkered linoleum floors bore the footprints of everyone from newborns to war veterans. Each booth had a napkin dispenser, a sugar caddy, and a salt shaker that clinked just slightly off-center. The corner booth by the window was unofficially reserved for local law enforcement, not by policy, but by decades of unspoken agreement, while the second booth near the entrance was usually taken by a couple of retired coal workers who drank their coffee like it was medicine. The diner didn't play music, but there was always a low hum, conversations, the sizzle from the kitchen, and the occasional cough from Old Man Rucker, who coughed whether he was sick or not. Behind the counter stood a long, slightly warped counter, lined with 5 stools, one of them always just slightly shorter than the others. Anna worked just behind that counter, her space defined by spatulas, cutting boards, the double fryer, and an old griddle seasoned by memory. Everything had a place. The knives were always sharp, not because she feared for her safety, but because dullness, in any form, irritated her. The fridge was stocked with local eggs, the butter was always real, and nothing ever came frozen except the crinkle-cut fries, which May insisted stayed on the menu because the townsfolk loved them. Above the pass-through window, a little hand-painted sign read, "Good food, no fuss." It had been there since 1982. Anna never gave thought to changing it. The town around Maze moved like a slow breath. Just outside the diner, Main Street stretched 2 blocks in either direction, before it bled into gravel roads and rusted mailboxes. Kids rode their bikes in lazy loops near the fire station. The church bell rang on Sundays even if no one showed up. Most of the businesses were family-run, and most families had been there long before Anna ever arrived. The local mechanic, Denny Walters, could fix a transmission blindfolded and swore by sweet tea more than any doctor's orders. Sheriff Ray Holloway, a broad man with a thinning mustache and more bark than bite, patrolled in a patrol car that rattled like a shopping cart, but still got him where he needed to be. Everyone knew everyone, and by extension, everyone knew Anna, at least by name and profession. But few ever asked her about her life before the diner, and she was grateful for that. Grayson Hollow was the kind of place where things didn't happen quickly or often, and people liked it that way. The hills that surrounded the town felt protective, as if nature itself wanted to keep Grayson Hollow wrapped in a cocoon of slowness and simplicity. But the same stillness that gave comfort could also create a false sense of permanence. People mistook the quiet for safety. They forgot that danger didn't always announce itself with sirens or headlines. Sometimes it rode in on the back of a motorcycle, wearing a leather vest and a cruel grin. The town wasn't used to disruption, and when it came, it rippled through the streets like a stone through a still pond. The morning the bikers arrived, that ripple became a tremor. Anna, standing behind the counter of the diner that morning, sensed the shift immediately. She didn't need to see their faces to recognize trouble. It was in the rumble of their engines, in the way the birds scattered as they rolled in the way the regulars suddenly stopped chewing. She had been taught to read the air the way others read books, not just what people said, but what they didn't, how they moved, where their eyes landed. She noticed the flinch of the mayor's wife when the door opened, the way her hand involuntarily moved toward her purse. She noted how Frank the dishwasher stepped closer to the kitchen entrance, not out of bravery but instinctive retreat. All of it fed into the bigger picture, the one Anna's mind constructed in seconds. The bikers weren't here for food, they were here for dominance. They had picked this town because it looked soft and quiet, but appearances were deceiving, especially hers. Though Grayson Hollow wasn't a place known for conflict, Anna had never let herself be lulled into the same sense of sleepy security. Her routines weren't just for order, they were for readiness. She had mapped every exit in the diner her first week there. She knew where the fire extinguisher was, which kitchen knives balanced best in her hand, and how to block the back door from being kicked in. None of the townsfolk knew that, and she never flaunted it. She didn't want them to live on edge. That was her job, even if they never asked her to do it. She didn't see herself as a protector, but she had never been able to shake the voice in her head, her father's voice, reminding her that preparedness was never wasted. Grayson Hollow was peaceful, yes, but that peace had always been conditional. It had simply never been tested, until now. The man who led the 3 bikers into May's diner went by the name Gage Rourke, though most just called him Gator. No one knew why, but it fit him. Slick, predatory, and unpredictable. He was in his late 40s but looked younger in a hardened, burned-out way. His arms were thick and inked with the kinds of tattoos that weren't about art, but memory. Jail time, gang affiliations, scars commemorated in black and gray. His leather vest bore the emblem of a jagged snake coiled around a gear, the patch of a loosely organized biker group that had cropped up in the region over the last year. They weren't a traditional MC with rules or codes. They were opportunists, drifters with an edge. They didn't claim territory so much as they took advantage of places too slow or too small to push back. And now, Grayson Hollow had popped up on their radar as an easy mark, isolated, quiet, with aging law enforcement and a local economy too fragile to stand up to intimidation. Gator wasn't new to this game. He'd been running small-town shakedowns long before the snake and gear patch ever got stitched to his back. He understood the psychology of fear better than most. Walk into a place loud, claim a seat like you own it, Stare down anyone who dares to make eye contact, and speak with the casual tone of someone who has nothing to lose. That alone unsettled most people. When that didn't work, his fists usually did. He didn't come to towns like Grayson Hollow looking for a fight. He came expecting the absence of one. Fear was currency, and intimidation was the exchange. He didn't see himself as a thug, but as a businessman. He and his two crew members, Crow and Diesel, had hit a few diners like this over the last few weeks, usually just for food and a display of power. No one ever pushed back. The cook kept their head down. The owner gave them discounts they never asked for, and the locals stayed quiet. Occasionally, someone tried to puff up, but they were quickly reminded how fragile the human body could be under the right amount of pressure. When Gator walked into Maze and saw Anna behind the counter, he clocked her as the kind of woman who'd learned to stay small. She didn't smile, didn't panic, just watched. That intrigued him. Most women in these situations either avoided eye contact or overcompensated with fake politeness. This one just stood there, still, like she was waiting for something to finish. He didn't like it. That unreadable stillness irritated him in a way he couldn't name. He leaned on the counter, flexing presence, and letting his voice drop into the kind of drawl designed to sound both casual and threatening. He made a few remarks, nothing overt at first, just enough to let her know he was watching, to gauge how easily she'd flinch. But she didn't. Not when he asked what was good on the menu. Not when he remarked about her eyes. Not even when Diesel laughed behind him and asked if the, quote, cute cook came with the combo. Crow, the third biker, scanned the room with the restless energy of a man who needed action. He was younger, wirier, but carried a switchblade habitually, flicking it open and shut with a rhythm that made everyone at nearby tables nervous. He leaned against the doorframe like he was ready to bolt or pounce, depending on which way the wind blew. Diesel, on the other hand, was the brute. Thick-necked, slow-talking, and quick to anger. His role was usually to back up Gator's threats with physical presence. He had broken a man's arm in a diner 2 towns over, simply because the man asked them to turn their music down. No one called the cops that day. No one even finished their lunch. The 3 of them formed a mobile storm system, loud, toxic, and always drifting toward a weak structure they could tear apart. To Gator, this diner was just another roadhouse, another stop on the path of petty conquest. But what he didn't expect, what none of them expected, was resistance wrapped in silence. He leaned in further across the counter, not because he needed something, but because he needed control. When he threatened, people usually yielded. That was the rhythm. That was the ritual. But Anna didn't give him what he wanted. Her lack of fear was like static in his system. It interrupted the flow of dominance he'd perfected over years of manipulation. She didn't look away. She didn't smile to soften the tension. She didn't even sigh. She simply observed. Gator was a man who fed on reaction, and her stillness felt like starvation. The tension in the diner thickened. The regulars were frozen, caught between the desire to protect and the fear of provoking. Sheriff Holloway wasn't present, and even if he had been, he wasn't the type to escalate unless absolutely necessary. Gator counted on that. He counted on passivity, on small-town law enforcement being too old or too outgunned to interfere. But what he failed to realize was that not all threats are loud. Not all strength comes with size or swagger. Some threats wait. Some strengths are inherited, trained, and hidden until they're needed most. He was playing a game he thought he'd already won, and that would be his first mistake. To Gator and his crew, Anna was just another cook in another forgettable town. But they had unknowingly stepped into a story far older and deeper than their own. A story shaped by discipline, loss, and a relentless code passed down from a man who had taught his daughter how to end a threat without hesitation. The balance of power was not as obvious as Gator thought. He believed himself to be the lion in the room, but what he didn't know, What he couldn't have imagined was that the woman in front of him had been raised to survive among wolves and trained to dismantle predators like him. Alls. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long orange streaks across the small town of Elridge as the diner's evening crowd began to trickle in. Maisie wiped down the counter for the 5th time, her motions methodical. Each stroke meant more to keep herself centered than to clean. She had managed to shake off the encounter earlier that day, at least on the surface. But something about the biker's eyes had stuck with her. Not the bravado, not the arrogant smirk, but the cold flicker underneath, as if he was playing a long game, one she hadn't yet figured out. Still, she reminded herself of the mantra her father taught her, calm is strength. She poured a fresh pot of coffee, nodded politely to the 2 older men settling into the booth near the jukebox, and forced herself to smile. The diner was her sanctuary, a place she'd worked hard to keep untainted by the chaos of the world outside. That sanctity, however, was beginning to feel compromised. As if summoned by her thoughts, the jingle of the entrance bell rang sharply, drawing everyone's attention. The biker, Cash, walked in again, this time without the chaos of revving engines or loud companions. He was alone, but his presence filled the room with a tension that made the air thick. Maisie felt her chest tighten. His boots thudded against the floor with slow deliberation as he made his way toward the counter and slid onto the same stool he had occupied earlier. The regulars watched cautiously from their booths, forks pausing mid-air, conversations trailing off. Maisie didn't flinch. She straightened her apron and approached him like she would any other customer. Cash didn't speak right away. He watched her pour a cup of coffee, his fingers drumming lightly on the counter. When she set the cup in front of him, he finally spoke, his voice low and calm. Told her she had guts. Most people wouldn't stand their ground after a day like this. He said it like a compliment, but it dripped with something else. An edge, a warning, maybe even curiosity. Maisie kept her expression neutral, thanked him flatly, and moved to take another order, but he reached out and gently tapped the counter with one finger. She paused. Cash asked her if she knew who he really was, what his crew had done in other towns. He described, without naming specifics, a trail of quieted businesses, bar owners who bent the knee, people who learned it was easier to comply than to resist. He talked like someone delivering a sermon, confident in the righteousness of his intimidation. Maisie stood still, listening but not reacting. He was trying to bait her into fear, to assert dominance through storytelling. What he didn't realize was that Maisie had spent years listening to war stories around her father's kitchen table. Real ones, not puffed-up threats from men looking to scare someone into obedience. When he finished talking, she met his gaze with the same quiet strength she'd held all along, told him this was her town, her father's town, and they didn't scare easy around here. The silence in the room deepened. Cash's jaw twitched slightly, as if trying to decide whether to push harder or back off. Before he could make that decision, the door swung open again. This time it wasn't a customer or another biker. It was Sheriff Boone, a tall, no-nonsense man, with a grizzled face and a voice like gravel. He scanned the room, instantly sensing the tension. His eyes landed on Cash, then flicked to Maisie, who gave a subtle nod. Boone walked over, took a seat at the counter a few stools down, and ordered his usual without ever taking his eyes off the biker. There was something unspoken between the two men, a mutual understanding wrapped in unspoken warnings. Cash took a slow sip of his coffee, then muttered something under his breath, something about the law always showing up when he was just starting to have fun. Maisie felt a strange combination of gratitude and annoyance. She didn't need rescuing. Not really. But Boone's presence was a protective buffer. She couldn't deny was helpful in that moment. Still, she hated that she had to consider protection at all. The diner wasn't supposed to be a battleground. After a few more tense minutes, Cash stood, left a bill on the counter, and tipped his head toward Boone. He told Maisie she'd be seeing him again. The way he said it made it sound like a promise rather than a threat, but the difference was razor thin. Then he walked out, leaving the door to swing slowly closed behind him. Boone finally spoke, his voice soft enough for only her to hear. Asked if she was all right, if he needed to keep an eye on things for a while. Maisie hesitated, then shook her head. She was all right, but she also knew something had shifted. This wasn't over. Cash had tasted something different in her, defiance, strength, challenge, and men like him didn't walk away from that without trying to reclaim their sense of control. She needed to be ready, not just for another visit, but for whatever came with it, because this wasn't just about a diner anymore. This was about respect, legacy, and the hidden roots of strength that ran deeper than any biker gang could imagine. And Maisie had no intention of letting them take even an inch more than they already had. Colt felt a strange tightness in his chest as he watched Harper from the kitchen doorway that night. She moved with quiet precision, sliding pies into the display case, wiping down counters, and double-checking the prep list like she did every closing shift. He'd seen her do it 100 times by now, but something about tonight felt different. There was a quiet fire in her that wasn't there before, a new sharpness in her eyes, like steel glinting just beneath the surface. Ever since the run-in with the bikers, Harper had grown quieter, but not in the way that meant she was retreating. It was more like she was measuring everything, calculating. Colt had lived long enough to know the look of someone who wasn't afraid, but was choosing when to strike. He respected that. Still, it made him wonder who exactly this girl was. She wasn't just a small-town cook. That much was certain now. Business at the diner had picked up slightly since the incident. Word had spread quickly, as it always did in towns like Oakhaven. People didn't know the full story, but they knew Harper had stood her ground against men twice her size and walked away unshaken. Some thought it was just small-town gossip. Others were sure there was more to the story. Either way, more regulars started coming in, not just for the food, but to see Harper with their own eyes. They'd nod to her respectfully, sometimes even thank her for what she did, though no one really knew what exactly she had done. Harper, true to her nature, never corrected them, never offered details, just smiled politely and went back to work. But one evening, a man in a weathered navy cap approached the counter and studied her for a long moment before quietly saying, "Your father was a good man." Harper's hands froze mid-wipe on the countertop. She looked up, startled, but the man had already turned to leave. That was the first public clue. Colt noticed it, and so did a few other veterans who frequented the diner. The whispers started to grow. Behind the scenes, Harper had begun a quiet training routine again. Before and after her shifts, she'd use the old barn behind the diner as her personal gym. Her father had taught her the basics years ago: discipline, breathing, hand-to-hand defense, threat assessment, and she never let it go completely. But now, with the bikers still circling like vultures in the outskirts of town, she felt the need to be sharper than ever. She wasn't afraid of them, not really, but she understood danger, and she understood that it had a way of returning when you least expected it. So she trained push-ups, core work, target drills with a wooden dummy she'd built herself, even silent running through the wooded trails behind the diner. Harper didn't tell anyone about it. She didn't need applause. She needed readiness. She needed to be prepared. Colt, however, was not blind. He noticed the faint bruises on her knuckles one morning when she handed him a tray of eggs and bacon. He saw the slight stiffness in her stride, the kind that came after intense legwork, and he saw the way her eyes scanned every table with precision, noting exits, movements, behaviors. He'd seen those eyes before, back when he served. He'd seen them in SEALs and Rangers, those who had been trained not just to fight, but to think 3 steps ahead of a threat. It began to click. Colt started piecing together what she must have meant when she said her dad didn't need to raise his voice, because his presence was enough. That wasn't just fatherly wisdom. That was discipline, respect, and tactical control. Harper wasn't just a Navy SEAL's daughter. She'd been raised like one. And yet, even in the midst of her quiet vigilance, Harper still found moments of peace. She'd walk down to the lake after closing, letting the breeze brush through her hair as she stared into the stillness. She missed her dad more now than ever. There were nights she sat at the edge of the dock, remembering the sound of his boots as he walked toward her during childhood drills, the way he'd correct her form with a single glance, the way his stories from deployment had always held lessons, not just action. Harper didn't cry often, but she let herself grieve on those nights, not just for him, but for the girl she used to be before everything went sideways. She wished she could talk to him now, ask him what to do, how to handle a threat that wasn't coming straight at her but circling in shadows. But she already knew the answer. He'd taught her to trust her gut, her instincts, and to never let fear drive her decisions. Then, something shifted in town again. A series of minor thefts started to happen. Nothing huge, but enough to raise eyebrows. Gas siphoned from cars, tools missing from sheds, and once, a farmer's entire chicken coop broken into. Sheriff Toller made his usual rounds, but the department was small and stretched thin. The thefts had the markings of a scouting pattern, and Harper recognized it. Back in Coronado, her father had explained how gangs would use petty crimes to test community response times. The pattern was disturbingly familiar. She quietly started documenting times, locations, and frequencies. She didn't tell anyone at first, not even Colt. But she knew the bikers weren't done with her. They were waiting. Watching. Meanwhile, Colt was growing more uneasy. He'd begun carrying again. It had been years since he felt the need to, but something in the air told him this town was being sized up for something worse. He cleaned up the back office, installed a new lock, and quietly stocked a first aid kit. Harper noticed. She gave him a small nod one night after closing, and that nod said everything. They both knew something was coming. And then one day, a new figure rolled into town. A black Harley, with unfamiliar plates. The man wore no colors, no patches, but his eyes were cold, calculating. He stopped at the gas station, asked about the diner. The cashier, a 17-year-old girl named Lily, felt a chill in her bones when he smiled at her without warmth. That evening, he walked into the diner just before closing. Harper was the only one there. She met his gaze calmly, her hands resting on the counter, her posture relaxed but alert. The man sat down slowly and said nothing for a long time. Just stared at her, his fingers drumming on the table. Finally, he said, "So, you're the one who stood up to my boys." Harper didn't blink. Colt stood silently in the kitchen doorway, watching. The town had been quiet for a few weeks, but the silence was always the loudest, just before a storm. The silence that followed in the diner was heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. Jason stood frozen, his eyes locked on the door that had just closed behind the biker. Rachel's hand still hovered over the napkin dispenser, a subtle tremor running through her fingers. Everyone in the room seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for the world to resume its usual rhythm, but something had undeniably shifted. Jason took a cautious step forward and reached for Rachel's shoulder, his voice soft, asking if she was all right. She nodded, but her face was pale and her lips were pressed into a tight line, the kind of expression that speaks volumes more than any words could. Jason wasn't the only one who had seen the darkness in the biker's eyes. Everyone had. Yet what lingered in his own mind wasn't the biker's threat but Rachel's reaction to it. Not fear, not exactly, but something heavier, something born of experience. Jason had known fear, both on the street and in combat, and this wasn't it. What Rachel carried seemed like control honed through chaos, an inner stillness that only comes from facing something far worse and surviving. After the diner slowly resumed its life, with cautious chatter and the scraping of utensils returning, Rachel walked toward the back, claiming she needed to check the inventory. Jason offered to help, but she declined, brushing off his concern with a gentle smile that didn't reach her eyes. He watched her disappear behind the swinging kitchen doors and felt a weight settle in his chest. Something was wrong. Not just the situation, not just the biker, but something deeper beneath the surface of Rachel's life. It gnawed at him. Later that evening, when the last customers had filtered out and the closed sign hung against the glass, Jason and Rachel sat at the counter with coffee between them. The air outside had cooled, the sun long gone behind the Wyoming hills, and inside the diner, the fluorescent lights buzzed with a quiet familiarity. Jason sipped from his mug and finally said what he'd been holding back. He told her he recognized the stance she had taken, that moment when she didn't flinch as the biker's voice grew louder, or when his hand hovered close to her wrist. He told her it was a stance of someone trained not to react like the average person. Her eyes flickered, and the mug in her hand paused midair. Rachel didn't speak immediately, but her gaze met his, and it was then that he saw it, the storm behind her composure. She slowly set her mug down and leaned back, her fingers tapping a quiet rhythm on the countertop. She didn't tell him everything, not yet, but she shared enough to make Jason realize he was standing on the edge of a much deeper story. She told him her father had been in the military, a Navy SEAL with multiple deployments under his belt. She said growing up wasn't easy, that there were strict rules, lessons taught through grit, not comfort, and that her father didn't believe in raising someone who couldn't protect herself. She'd learned to throw a punch before she learned to ride a bike, trained in tactical awareness before she ever got her driver's license. But despite all that, her father had taught her one lesson above all others. True strength was knowing when not to use force. That's why she hadn't responded with violence earlier, even though every cell in her body had been ready to. Jason listened quietly, absorbing each word with the gravity it deserved. He saw now that Rachel wasn't just a diner cook. She wasn't just a quiet presence in the background of his daily life. She was someone forged through discipline, grief, and a legacy that few would understand. Over the next few days, the town buzzed with rumors. The biker's return was anticipated like a coming storm. People speculated, was he part of a larger gang? Was he testing the waters for something worse? Rachel went about her work like nothing had happened, but Jason could tell she was more alert, more measured in every movement. She scanned the parking lot more frequently, and her eyes lingered longer on unfamiliar faces. Jason couldn't shake the sense that something bigger was coming, something that would pull Rachel's past into the present with force. That evening, Jason visited Sheriff Harlan, a grizzled old veteran himself who ran the local department with equal parts wisdom and weariness. He told him everything about the biker, the confrontation, and Rachel's background. The sheriff raised an eyebrow at the mention of the Navy SEAL connection, then leaned back in his creaky chair and rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. He said he'd keep an eye out, but warned Jason not to push Rachel too hard. People like her, he said, carried burdens in silence for a reason. Back at the diner, Rachel found a note slipped under the back door. It was handwritten in jagged block letters. "You'll regret that stare." She stared at it for a long moment before folding it neatly and slipping it into her apron pocket. Jason saw her expression when she returned, calm on the surface, but a storm building underneath. That night, after locking up, she went home and opened a small, dust-covered box from the back of her closet. Inside was a photo of her father in uniform, a well-worn challenge coin, and a worn leather bracelet with a tiny embedded GPS chip, something he'd given her before his last deployment, saying, "If you ever need to vanish or fight back, this will help you start either." Rachel stared at the items in the box, her father's voice echoing in her memory. She had walked away from that life years ago, but the life hadn't walked away from her. If trouble was coming, she'd be ready, and this time, she wouldn't face it alone. Jason had seen enough now to stand with her, not as a protector, but as someone who understood what it meant to carry scars hidden beneath everyday smiles. As Rachel closed the box and placed it by her nightstand, her jaw tightened. The past was knocking. And if that biker thought she was just a cook in a small-town diner, he was about to learn the kind of truth only a Navy SEAL's daughter could deliver. The diner was unusually quiet the next morning. Even the early coffee crowd, the truckers and factory workers who usually filled the booths with casual laughter and banter, seemed subdued. Something in the air was different, thicker, heavier. Carla arrived at 5 a.m. sharp, as she always did, and went about her opening routine with quiet efficiency. The clatter of pans and hiss of the coffee machine filled the silence, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She replayed yesterday's confrontation in her mind, over and over, analyzing each moment, the look in Tex's eyes, the way her voice held steady, despite the tension in her chest. She'd held her ground, but something told her it wasn't over. Not with a man like him. Men like Tex didn't leave things alone. They came back, they retaliated. But she hadn't told her father. Not yet. She didn't want him to worry, and besides, she'd handled herself. It was over. Or so she hoped. But that hope was dashed around 8:15 a.m., just as the morning rush began to slow. Carla was refilling salt shakers near the front counter when she heard the unmistakable growl of motorcycle engines pulling into the lot. Not one or two this time, but at least half a dozen. Her hand paused over the salt lid as her eyes lifted toward the large window facing the parking lot. There they were. Tex, front and center, his massive frame dismounting with practiced ease, flanked by 5 others. Big men, leather jackets, patchwork vests, the same sneering demeanor. Her stomach sank, but she didn't flinch. She straightened her back and returned the salt shaker to its place. If they wanted intimidation, they'd find disappointment today. She called into the kitchen to keep the orders going and made her way to the front, her calm mask firmly in place. As the door jingled, all 6 men walked in with slow, deliberate steps, their boots echoing against the tile. The din of the remaining customers dimmed. Conversations stopped. Even the cook poked his head out from the kitchen, sensing the tension. Tex approached the counter, leaned an elbow on the surface and smirked. His face had a new bruise near his jawline. Carla's eyes flicked to it but said nothing. He began with a lazy comment about service, making crude jokes about small-town hospitality, and introduced his friends as if he were some kind of celebrity visiting a fan club. Carla listened without reaction. Her stance remained steady, her eyes cool. He was baiting her, trying to provoke something. But she refused to give him that power. Then Tex's tone shifted. The smiles faded. He lowered his voice and muttered just loud enough for her to hear. Comments about what happens to girls who talk big, and how some people don't know when to keep their heads down. She didn't blink. She asked if they were ordering food or loitering, her tone crisp, professional. He stared at her for a long moment, as if trying to read something deeper, then finally gave a mocking laugh and requested a round of black coffees and greasy eggs for his crew. As she turned to relay the order, her hands remained steady but her mind was whirring. She didn't know what his plan was, but it was clear he was escalating. Not just a visit. This was a power play. A message. They occupied 2 large booths in the back, laughing obnoxiously, cursing loudly, making a scene for the sake of intimidation. She watched the other customers begin to leave, one by one, some with awkward glances, others with hurried excuses. Within 20 minutes, the place was practically empty except for Tex's gang and Carla. Even the cook had retreated into the kitchen and stayed there, reluctant to engage. Carla delivered their plates herself, maintaining her composure even as crude jokes and veiled threats flew from the table. But Tex didn't seem satisfied. He wanted something more, something reactionary. And when he finally stood up and pretended to accidentally bump the coffee pot from her hand, sending scalding liquid across the floor and over her shoes, Carla's calm cracked, but only slightly. She stepped back, eyes on him, breathing steady. He leaned in close, towering over her, and murmured something vile and personal into her ear. That was when Carla stepped back, tilted her head slightly, and uttered a single sentence. 7 words. Quiet, but clear. My father trained Navy SEALs for decades. Tex's expression shifted. His smirk faltered for just a second. That second was all she needed. She continued, still calm. And every Sunday after church, I trained with him. There was a pause. A thick, heavy moment of silence, where even the sound of the sizzling grill seemed to fade. Tex stepped back, laughed nervously, and gestured to his friends. They laughed, too, but it sounded off-key, uncertain. Carla didn't move. She simply stood her ground, chin raised, gaze unflinching. Tex recovered quickly, throwing more insults, trying to recapture his dominance, but it was slipping. The seed of doubt had been planted. The narrative had changed. The crew finished their meals in strained silence, the earlier bravado drained. When they finally stood and paid, after Carla calmly announced that they would not be receiving any discount, they left without another word. But Carla knew that wouldn't be the end of it. She also knew now was the time to tell her father. This wasn't about pride anymore. It was about escalation. She cleaned up the broken pot, wiped down the tables, and called him on the diner's old rotary wall phone, the one he'd installed years ago and told her to use only in emergencies. When he answered, she spoke plainly. No drama, just facts. He was silent for a beat after she finished. Then he said he was on his way. And for the first time in 2 days, Carla felt her breath return fully. Not because her father would fix everything, but because now it was no longer her fight alone. And she had never truly been alone to begin with. The next day brought with it a shift in the atmosphere, one that could be felt even before the diner opened its doors. The sunrise painted the sky in streaks of coral and gold, but inside the rusted horseshoe, the stillness felt different. Not the peaceful kind, but more like the calm before a storm. Lila arrived early as usual, but this time her mind wasn't simply occupied with food prep or whether the coffee machine would behave. Her thoughts were consumed by questions that hadn't found answers, questions about her father's past, about her own boundaries, and about the mysterious weight behind those biker stairs. She had spoken with her father the night before, but he had remained characteristically vague. She didn't push. He had given her enough to chew on already, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more. Lila had never doubted her father's love or his teachings, but she now realized how little she truly knew about what he had lived through. That knowledge gave her a strange sort of power, a quiet confidence wrapped in caution. It made her stand straighter that morning as she prepped the griddle and restocked the pie case, like she was stepping into the skin of someone who had been in the shadows too long but was now ready to be seen for who she really was. By 7 a.m., the first regulars began to arrive. The usual chatter and coffee clinks filled the air. Marvin joked about Lila's new stern expression, and a few others teased her gently about the show they had missed the other day, referring to her silent standoff with the bikers. Lila smiled, but it was more polite than sincere. The weight of what might come lingered in her chest. And as if summoned by the very anticipation in the air, the door swung open a little after 8 o'clock, and in walked Brick and his crew. No theatrics this time. No loud voices or chest puffing. Just slow, deliberate steps that spoke of someone who had come not to intimidate, but to test the ground. Lila watched them walk in with that same clarity she had discovered within herself the day before. Brick's eyes scanned the room, and though he tried to hide it, there was a new sharpness to his gaze, a mix of curiosity, wariness, and calculation. They sat at their usual booth. Lila didn't hesitate. She approached their table with a pad in hand, not because she needed it, but because it was part of the ritual. Routine gave people comfort, and she needed them to believe she wasn't rattled. She wasn't. But she was alert. Brick ordered the same as always. Eggs over easy, bacon, extra crispy. The others followed suit, all eyes carefully observing her movements. But there were no smirks today. No muttered comments or long glances meant to provoke. The silence between them felt tight, suspended like a wire. When she turned to walk away, she could feel Brick's gaze follow her. In the kitchen, as she cooked, her hands worked automatically, but her ears stayed sharp, catching every word drifting from that booth. They weren't talking much, just the occasional murmur, an offhand joke, but nothing about her, nothing hostile, just presence. And sometimes presence is the loudest kind of communication. When she brought their plates out, Brick looked up and held her eyes for a moment longer than usual. She met it without blinking. There was no fear in her now, only a keen awareness of the unspoken message being exchanged. He didn't say thank you, but he didn't need to. The respect was implicit. As she turned back to tend to other customers, she felt something shift inside her again, not dramatically, but enough to register. It was as if standing in the fire had burned off the excess and left behind a purer version of herself. Her mind wandered again to her father. Had he stood like this once, surrounded by men who underestimated him, who tested him until they realized their mistake? Had he carried this same stillness within him, this sense that true strength doesn't make a scene, it waits patiently to be revealed? Later that afternoon, when the diner quieted again, and only a few tables remained occupied, Brick approached the counter. Lila was wiping down mugs, humming faintly under her breath. He placed a 20 on the counter for a $10 meal. She raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Brick leaned in slightly, his voice low but not threatening. It had a strange calm to it, a kind of reluctant respect. He said he didn't know who her father was until after their last visit. Said someone made a few calls. That they knew now. Lila didn't ask who they were, she didn't care. She simply looked at him and nodded. Message received. She wasn't a victim, and she didn't need a loud confrontation to prove her place. She was exactly where she belonged. And they all knew it now. Brick added something else as he turned to leave, that her father was a hell of a man, and that she reminded him of someone he used to respect a long time ago. It wasn't an apology, but it was something. Lila let him walk out without another word. Some battles weren't fought with fists or fury. Some were won with presence, restraint, and the unflinching courage to stand tall even when surrounded. The door closed behind him, and the diner felt lighter, like a storm had passed and left everything scrubbed clean. By the time the diner doors opened the next morning, the sun was still stretching its golden fingers across the mountains, casting long shadows over the dewy road that led to Bender's. Maisie had already been at work for over an hour, her hands busy but her mind adrift, caught in a storm of memories and uncertainty. She tried to move with her usual rhythm, flipping eggs, checking coffee pots, wiping down counters, but her body betrayed her with a tension that knotted her shoulders and made her fingers twitch every time the door chimed open. It wasn't fear anymore, it was anticipation, a sense that the lines between what was right and what was legal, between justice and revenge, were beginning to blur. Deputy Ruiz had called her just before sunrise. The call was short, clipped, yet heavy with subtext. "We found Rafe's bike, abandoned, torched, and left at the foot of Echo Ridge. No sign of him. I'll let you know what we find." That was it. No encouragement, no promises, just a report. It was as if the authorities had already closed the book on Rafe Dillon, as if men like him simply vanished into the cracks when things turned sour. Maisie didn't believe that. She knew predators. She'd grown up around warriors who taught her the scent of real danger, and that scent still lingered in the air around Lockwood. The regulars shuffled in slowly that morning, giving Maisie nods and quiet greetings. Many had heard about the incident through whispers and late-night texts. No one mentioned it directly, but their glances lingered too long, their voices hushed, just a bit more than usual. It was the kind of quiet respect small towns showed when something serious passed through like a storm. But Maisie couldn't find comfort in their concern. Not when the storm hadn't yet passed. At 9:10 a.m., the bell above the door rang and the diner hushed. Sheriff Cody Marston entered with his usual authority, tall, silver-haired, and built like a former linebacker. He removed his sunglasses slowly, giving Maisie a look that said he wasn't there for a meal. "Back room," she said before he could ask. He nodded and followed her through the swinging kitchen doors, past racks of fresh biscuits and simmering gravy pots, into the narrow utility space she used as an office. She didn't sit, neither did he. "You found his bike," she said, arms crossed. "Burned," Marston confirmed. "Half melted down to the frame, no prints, no blood. Just one of his rings. Left right on the seat like a calling card." "He's not running," she said. "He's watching." "That's what worries me," Marston replied. "We've got no clue where he is. But if he's waiting, it's likely not for redemption." Maisie gave a grim smile. "Men like Rafe don't do redemption. They wait for weakness. They wait until you breathe easy again. Then they strike." Marston rubbed the back of his neck, his shoulders stiff. "Maisie, you're a civilian. I know who your dad was. I respect your history. But this isn't your fight. It became my fight when he put a knife to my throat and left a dead dog on my porch. Which we're handling." "Not fast enough," Marston sighed. "Look, I've requested a patrol unit to circle the area for the next few nights. Stay home. Lock your doors. Don't go wandering into the woods." "He won't come through the woods," she said softly. "He's too much of a showman for that. He'll come through the front door." Marston didn't argue. He knew she was right. She had a way of seeing angles others missed. "We'll keep you posted," he said, tipping his hat. She didn't watch him leave. Her mind was already spinning through worst-case scenarios. That night, Maisie didn't sleep. She closed the diner early and stayed behind after hours, sitting in the back booth with her father's old duffel beside her. Inside it were the tools she never wanted to use again, items that spoke of a past soaked in discipline, survival, and secrets. A worn combat knife with the initials JAR etched into the handle, a collapsible baton, a lockpick set, even a burner phone that still worked after all these years. She stared at them as if they were pieces of a former self buried in the rubble of normalcy. Around midnight, a noise shattered the stillness, a sharp creak from the back alley. She froze. Slowly, she reached under the table and drew the baton, clicking it open with a swift flick. Her breath slowed, trained and steady. She moved silently across the floor, her boots making no sound against the vinyl tiles. The alley door was closed, but something had been left just outside it. She pushed the door open with her foot and scanned the area. No one, but on the ground was a single object, a fork, bent into the shape of a snake. She picked it up, the metal still warm. A message, a warning, or a game. Her jaw tightened. She didn't need to sleep tonight. She needed to be ready. The fork clinked against the counter as she set it down with care. If Rafe thought he was hunting her, he'd soon learn the truth. She wasn't the prey. Not now. Not ever. It wasn't just the punch that silenced the room. It was the brutal honesty of it. The way April moved, the clarity in her stance, the steel in her eyes. It all communicated something most people in that diner hadn't seen before, and definitely not from her. Gavin stumbled backward into a chair, one hand clutching his face, the other reaching for support, as if reality had just struck him harder than April's knuckles did. Time seemed to compress for a few seconds, the world narrowing into her slow, deliberate steps as she picked up the first aid kit from beneath the counter and set it quietly on a table. Her expression was unreadable, calm, almost methodical. Gavin's gang, for the first time since they rolled into Crest Hill, didn't know what to do. They looked at each other for guidance, but found none. The balance had shifted so sharply that they didn't even know where to stand anymore. The woman they had underestimated, insulted and cornered, was now the one person in the room who wasn't rattled. Charlie was the first to move. He stood slowly, his height imposing but now filled with uncertainty. His voice cracked the tense air as he spoke, not to Gavin, but to April. "Who the hell are you?" he asked, not in defiance but almost in awe. April didn't answer immediately. She opened the first aid kit and pulled out an alcohol pad and some gauze. "That's a question I haven't had to answer in a while," she replied softly, then turned her eyes to Gavin, who was now wiping blood from his nose and trying to regain his composure. But maybe it's time someone reminded people what happens when you push good people too far. Charlie didn't press her. He stepped back. There was something in her tone that held weight, like a promise rather than a threat. By now, the sheriff's deputy, who'd been on lunch break a few blocks down, had arrived, responding to a hurried call from one of the diner's patrons. He stepped through the door, gun holstered but hand on it, scanning the room quickly. "What happened here?" he asked, eyes flicking from Gavin's bruised face to April, who stood calmly beside the counter, arms crossed. Several people began speaking at once, trying to explain, but the deputy held up his hand. "One at a time," he said. But before he could pick someone, Gavin spat blood onto the floor and pointed at April. "That cook assaulted me," he snapped, unprovoked. April said nothing. She simply looked at the deputy, then nodded toward the security camera mounted in the far corner of the diner. "You might want to check the footage before you write anything down," she said. Her voice wasn't angry or defensive. It was simply factual. The deputy glanced up, registered the camera, and gave a short nod. "All right," he said. "I'll need to see that, and I'll need statements from everyone." But even as he spoke, something else began to unfold. The gang members, those who had come in loud and threatening, began quietly exiting the diner, slipping away into the parking lot without a word. Whatever loyalty they had to Gavin, it was clearly conditional. They had seen enough to know they weren't going to win anything by sticking around. And Gavin, bleeding and alone, suddenly looked very small in the grand scheme of things. The deputy took April aside after checking the footage, his demeanor shifting once he saw what had actually occurred. "Miss Holloway," he said, now addressing her with a bit more formality, "do you want to press charges?" April looked at Gavin, who now sat slumped in the corner booth, staring at the table like it held all the regrets of his life. She shook her head. "No," she said, "but I want him to understand that the people in this town aren't afraid of him anymore." The deputy nodded again. "He won't forget," he said. By the next morning, word had spread. The story took on a life of its own. How April Holloway, the quiet cook who always wore a simple braid and never spoke much, had put a gang leader on the floor and changed the way Crest Hill saw itself. People who had once kept their heads down now held them a little higher. Diners and shops reopened their doors with fresh confidence. And Gavin? He left town later that day, alone, his gang long gone, his pride somewhere on the linoleum floor of the Silver Spoon Diner. But for April, it wasn't about pride. It was about reclaiming something deeper, her peace. That night, after the diner had closed and the booths had been wiped down, she sat at the corner table where her father once took her for milkshakes. She pulled a small photograph from her wallet, her father in his Navy SEAL uniform, smiling in the sun, one arm around a much younger April. She placed it on the table, next to her tea. "Thanks, Dad," she whispered, and for the first time in a long time, she smiled. She had never wanted to be the center of attention, but sometimes the quiet ones aren't just background noise. Sometimes they're the heartbeat of the whole place. Sometimes they're the legacy of something powerful. And when pushed, they remind everyone what strength really looks like. April Holloway had done just that, not just for herself, but for every soul in Crest Hill who had forgotten that courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just cooks your eggs right and protects you while doing it. The days following the community's show of gratitude brought an odd sense of stillness to the little town of Grey Ridge, as if the air itself were recovering from the tension it had held in the weeks prior. Elena found herself back in the diner's kitchen, not just cooking but reflecting. She stirred sauce with care and wiped down counters with slow precision, not because the work required it, but because the silence offered a space to process everything. Her routine, once simple and uninterrupted, now carried weight and memory. Every plate she served reminded her of how close she'd come to walking away, and how deeply rooted she had become in the hearts of the townspeople. Customers continued to pour in, not just to eat, but to linger, to check in on her, to quietly say thank you with warm smiles and extra tips folded beneath coffee mugs. Some left notes, folded pieces of paper she'd find hours later, thanking her not for the food, but for her courage, for standing tall when it mattered, even when no one had asked her to. Word had spread beyond the diner. News outlets came calling, and small stories ran in local papers about the diner cook who stood up to bikers, and the Navy SEAL's daughter who taught a town how to fight back with honor. Elena turned down the interview requests. She didn't want the spotlight. She just wanted to cook. And maybe, once in a while, to look out into a full dining room and feel the warmth of something bigger than herself. Mark came by often, more relaxed now, a little more human than the tough exterior he usually wore. He started helping around the diner when he wasn't on patrol, tightening the loose chairs, replacing the flickering lights, even repainting the chipped menu board. He never brought up the night with Axel unless Elena mentioned it first, but every now and then she'd catch a glimmer in his eye, a kind of awe not just for what she'd done, but for who she had become. Their friendship had grown in the unlikeliest of ways, but it was real now, forged not in flirtation or convenience, but in battle and belief. One afternoon, Elena found herself seated across from him on the diner's porch, 2 lemonade glasses sweating on the table between them. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a soft glow on the sidewalk. Mark had just finished fixing the screen door, and she'd brought out a slice of pecan pie as thanks. He took a bite and smiled the kind of smile that didn't need words. In that moment, Elena saw something in his gaze that surprised her. Not admiration, not gratitude, but trust, the kind that's rarely given and even more rarely earned. It was then that he spoke about his own past, about a time he'd frozen up during a drug bust early in his career, how the guilt had eaten at him, how he'd spent years trying to prove to himself that he wasn't a coward, and how, watching Elena face Axel, he'd seen in her the kind of courage he'd always hoped to carry. It humbled her, and it healed something in him. Axel, meanwhile, had disappeared. No sightings, no rumors. It was as if he had vanished into the wind. For some, this was a relief. For others, a question mark that hovered uncomfortably over every calm day. Elena chose not to let the shadow of his return darken her peace. She had seen enough, fought enough, and grown enough to know that fear didn't deserve permanent residence in her heart. Still, she stayed alert. When shipments arrived, she inspected them herself. She changed the locks on the back doors and installed a new security camera above the rear alley. Not out of paranoia, but preparedness. There was a difference. One morning, as she was prepping ingredients before the morning rush, a package arrived without a return address. It was wrapped in plain brown paper, sealed tightly. Elena opened it cautiously. Inside was a small wooden carving of an eagle in flight, wings outstretched, talons sharp. Beneath it, a single line on a torn piece of paper. "Your father would be proud. A." She stared at it for a long time, unsure whether to be unnerved or touched. Maybe both. But as she set the carving on the shelf above the stove, she realized something. Fear and pride could coexist, as long as courage sat in between them. It didn't matter if Axel had meant the message as a threat or a tribute. What mattered was her response, and she chose to keep cooking. Meanwhile, her relationship with her father deepened in subtle, powerful ways. He still sent those brief texts. "Heard about the biker. Nice work. Mom would have baked a cake in your honor." But occasionally he'd call. Their conversations were short, often punctuated by long pauses, but they were conversations. Progress. He even sent a small framed photo of Elena as a toddler, sitting on his shoulders, both of them covered in sand from a beach she barely remembered. It arrived without a note, but it didn't need one. She placed it near the register, where customers could see it. Some asked who the man was. She'd just smile and say, "That's my dad. He taught me how to stand my ground." In time, the town began to heal, not just from the fear Axel brought, but from its own history of silence and complacency. A new neighborhood watch formed. Town hall meetings became more crowded. People spoke up more, helped out more. A diner cook had reminded them of something they'd forgotten, that strength didn't always come from the loudest voice or the biggest fists, but from quiet conviction and the courage to act when no one else would. Elena felt this shift every time she tied her apron. The work hadn't changed. The orders still came in, the dishes still piled up, and the air still smelled of coffee and fried onions. But everything felt more alive now, more purposeful. She wasn't just feeding people. She was part of something larger, something unshakable. And as she watched the sun rise through the diner's front window, she knew one thing for sure. She was exactly where she was meant to be. The dust settled in the lot behind the diner as Wade leaned back on his bike, the tension in his shoulders finally loosening. He watched the others from his crew slowly roll out in ones and twos, silent nods exchanged as if to say they understood what had happened, even if they didn't know all the details. There was an unspoken rule among men like them: when something rattled the ground beneath your boots, you didn't question it out loud. You just carried it with you and hoped it didn't crush you later. Inside the diner, the cleanup had started. Maya was on her knees, scrubbing at a broken bottle sticky trail of root beer, her arms moving in steady, practiced circles. Her father, Roy, was sweeping up a shattered salt shaker that had been kicked under a booth. The world seemed to have paused for breath after the chaos, as if even time itself was catching up with what had occurred. Roy kept glancing at the door, half expecting another confrontation to rear its head, but all he found each time was the stillness of the late afternoon sun stretching over the parking lot. Maya had been quiet since the bikers left, her usually sharp eyes far away, gazing at some internal reel only she could see, not of fear, not quite, but of contemplation, as though pieces of her life that had been scattered and buried long ago had suddenly been excavated. She hadn't wanted to talk about her past, not even to herself, but today had forced her hand. Roy crouched beside her, brushing aside some glass she'd missed, his voice low and steady as he said her name. Her response came slower than usual, almost hesitant, and when she looked at him, he saw something he hadn't seen in years, his daughter staring through him like she wasn't quite in the room. She blinked hard, cleared her throat, and finally muttered something about needing air. He let her go. Outside, the breeze was picking up, bringing with it a whisper of the nearby pines, the smell of distant rainfall that hadn't reached them yet. Maya leaned against the side wall of the diner, closed her eyes, and drew in a long breath, trying to recalibrate her inner compass. She didn't want to be that woman, the woman with a past defined by pain, by trauma, by expectation. She had come here to start new, to pour coffee and flip pancakes and forget about the gunmetal taste of adrenaline. But you never really forget, do you? It stays in your bones like the hum of a tuning fork, vibrating just below the surface. And today, when everything went sideways, it hadn't been the training that guided her, not entirely. It had been something deeper. Instinct, love, legacy. Later that night, as the diner closed and Roy finished counting the till, Maya found herself staring at the old picture on the wall again. The same one she used to ignore, the black and white photo of her mother in uniform, standing beside a squad of other elite operators, all dressed in gear that made them look like shadows. Her mother's face was expressionless, but Maya had always seen more than what was captured. There had been resilience there, command, depth. Maya touched the frame gently, then made a decision. She went upstairs to her small apartment above the diner and pulled open the storage box she hadn't looked through in years. Inside were things that didn't belong in this sleepy town. Her mother's medals, her folded flag, old letters filled with wisdom and warnings, and at the bottom, a small photo of her as a child, holding hands with her mother in a training field surrounded by cinder-block walls and barbed wire. She took the photo out and placed it on the table. It wasn't just nostalgia that filled her chest. It was a rekindling of duty, of strength, of the understanding that even here, in this quiet diner life she had chosen, there was still purpose in her blood. Meanwhile, Wade hadn't left town. He'd told his men to go ahead without him and pulled into the old motel by the edge of town. Something about today had gotten under his skin, not just the way he'd been humbled, but the way he'd watched a woman, calm, firm, unflinching, hold a room together with her voice alone. He'd never seen anything like it, and despite himself, he couldn't shake the image from his mind. He kept replaying the moment she'd stepped forward and faced him down like she'd been forged in fire. He wasn't used to being wrong, but now that he knew what he did, now that he understood she had been trained by someone even he wouldn't cross, it changed everything. His curiosity gnawed at him like hunger. At sunrise the next day, Roy was already wiping down the counter when Wade returned. The bell above the door jingled, the kind of soft chime that felt too delicate for a man like him. Roy didn't flinch this time. He looked up, ready for whatever this man had come back to finish. But Wade wasn't here to fight. Not today. He walked to the counter, took off his shades, and nodded at the empty stool in front of him. Roy slowly nodded, gesturing for him to sit. Maya emerged from the kitchen with a pot of coffee, the lines on her face unreadable, her posture relaxed but alert. Wade glanced up at her and said two words that no one expected. "Thank you." And in that moment everything shifted again, but this time not because of violence or threat, this time because of respect. The sun was beginning to sink low behind the mountain ridge, casting a golden hue across the quiet town as the diner bustled with a steady stream of customers coming in for their evening meals. From the outside, everything looked just as peaceful as it had always been, but inside, a subtle electricity filled the air, like everyone had begun to sense that something big was about to shift. Riley moved with precision behind the counter, flipping burgers, pouring coffee, and exchanging quiet pleasantries with regulars. Her eyes, however, never stopped scanning. There was a deep stillness in her now, not one born of fear or anxiety, but of unwavering resolve. Ever since that night behind the diner with Tank, something within her had changed. The weight of the truth, the knowledge of her lineage, and the quiet approval of her father, unspoken yet deeply felt, had fortified her spirit. She no longer saw herself as just a cook, with a complicated past. She was the daughter of a man who had walked through hell and back, and she now knew she had inherited more from him than she had ever believed. At the back booth near the window, Hank sat alone nursing a cup of black coffee, his patched leather vest slung over the back of the chair, his hands clasped in front of him, resting on the Formica tabletop. He looked older, somehow, though only a few days had passed since the incident with Tank. The lines around his eyes had deepened. There was a quietness to him now, as if his own confrontation with Riley's truth had forced him to reevaluate everything. He no longer barked orders or prowled through the diner like he owned it. Instead, he watched her with a complicated mix of respect and regret. Occasionally, his gaze would drift to the corner where Tank had once stood, threatening Riley with his twisted smile, and the memory would pull a frown across his features. Hank had made a decision, a quiet, difficult one, but it was only a matter of time before he'd have to act on it. His club was no longer just about the brotherhood or the open road. It had become a shadow of what it once was, co-opted by men like Tank, who valued power over principle. Hank had always walked the line between outlaw and protector, but now, in the wake of Riley's calm bravery, he realized that line was no longer blurred. It was crystal clear. He had stood by and let something ugly grow under his watch, and the time had come to put an end to it. Across the counter, Artie sat on a stool, scribbling in his sketchbook with his ever-present cup of milk by his side. He had returned to the diner each day like clockwork, never once acknowledging the night Tank had nearly shattered the peace of the place. But his drawings had changed. The pages no longer featured robots or racing cars. Instead, he was sketching a girl with short hair and strong arms, standing in front of a roaring storm with her head held high. Riley had seen the pages, smiled quietly, and ruffled his hair without a word. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, one of shared strength, of surviving something bigger than both of them. Then, near closing time, the bell above the door jingled and everyone looked up. A man stepped in, tall and lean, wearing a clean button-up and dusty boots. He walked with the kind of posture that didn't demand attention, but commanded it nonetheless. His eyes scanned the diner slowly until they found Riley, and when she met his gaze, her breath caught. It was her father, Clint Maddox. Not in uniform, not as a war hero, but as the man behind the stories. Flesh and blood, standing in the doorway of her world at last. The diner seemed to fade into the background as he walked forward, his expression unreadable. Riley wiped her hands on her apron and stepped around the counter, unsure what to say. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, in 1,000 different ways, and yet none of them had prepared her for the reality of it. He stood before her, his presence steady and quiet, and then he simply opened his arms. She walked into them, and for the first time in years, let herself be small again, if only for a moment. There were no tears, no grand speeches. Just a firm embrace, a slow inhale, and the feeling of finally belonging to something bigger than herself. Clint had come not just to see her, but to stay a while. His tour had ended, and he had decided to come back not as a warrior, but as a father. Over the next few days, the townspeople began to notice his presence, discreet, respectful, always a few steps behind Riley, watching her handle the diner with confidence. He didn't interfere, didn't overshadow her. He simply existed as a quiet reminder of where she came from and how far she had come. Meanwhile, Hank began making quiet moves of his own. Conversations held in alleys, phone calls made from untraceable numbers, and finally a meeting held at a burned-out warehouse on the edge of town, where the remaining members of the club gathered, expecting business as usual. But Hank wasn't there to talk business. He was there to disband the crew. He made it clear, any man still loyal to Tank's methods could take their colors and leave. There would be no war, no retaliation. The road they had traveled together had come to an end. Surprisingly, more men stayed than left. They weren't all bad, some were just lost. But under Hank's new direction, the club would return to its roots: brotherhood, loyalty, and respect. Back at the diner, life began to settle into a new rhythm. Clint sometimes helped in the kitchen, surprising patrons with his calm demeanor and quiet sense of humor. Riley finally allowed herself to laugh again, real deep belly laughter that made her eyes shine. Artie drew more heroes than ever. Hank showed up every now and then, not to intimidate, but to quietly sip coffee and watch the world shift. And yet, there was still one piece left unresolved: Tank. The man had vanished into the wind after that night behind the diner. No one knew where he'd gone or what he was planning, but deep down, Riley knew he wasn't finished. Not yet. And if he came back, she would be ready. Not because she was her father's daughter, not because of any training or legacy, but because she had discovered something far more powerful than fear: her own voice. The courtroom was unusually quiet as Judge Langford leaned forward, his gaze stern, but tinged with curiosity. All eyes turned to Maddie as she stood beside her attorney, a calm presence amid a room filled with tension. Across the aisle, Hawk looked utterly drained, his once fiery demeanor now replaced by resignation and guilt. Maddie's statement was clear, firm, and filled with a grace that many found unexpected. She didn't seek vengeance. She didn't want to punish Hawk in the way he had tried to punish others. Instead, she spoke about cycles of violence, pain, and fear, and how someone had to be the one to break them. She believed that justice didn't always have to come in the form of a cell. Sometimes, it came from confrontation, truth, and a second chance to do better. Her voice never shook as she expressed her belief that Hawk's punishment should include mandatory counseling, community service, and a program that helped formerly incarcerated individuals integrate back into society. There was a collective breath in the courtroom when she finished, as if everyone had been holding it, unsure of how she would wield her power. Judge Langford, after a long pause, agreed. Hawk wouldn't be let off lightly, but Maddie's influence shaped the outcome in a way no one had anticipated. He would serve time under strict supervision, but his road to redemption would be paved with personal effort and community responsibility. When Maddie stepped out of the courthouse, the sun hit her face like a quiet blessing. She looked over and saw her father leaning against his old truck, arms crossed, and his proud smile unmistakable. Maddie walked toward him, and he opened his arms without saying a word. Their embrace spoke volumes. As they pulled back, he handed her a small object wrapped in cloth. She opened it to find his Navy SEAL trident pin, aged but gleaming. He told her it was hers now, not because she had worn the uniform, but because she had carried the spirit behind it: discipline, honor, courage, and selflessness. Maddie clutched the pin and blinked back tears. That night, the diner reopened quietly. No grand announcements, no banners, just the familiar glow of neon against the darkness and the sound of pans clinking, coffee brewing, and laughter returning. Locals came in, some shyly at first, but soon the booths filled, and the diner felt alive again. Maddie was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, spatula in hand, humming an old tune her mom used to play on the jukebox. Charlie returned too, working the counter like nothing had happened, but his eyes twinkled with a new kind of respect for the girl he'd once underestimated. Everyone who walked through the door that evening noticed a subtle shift. The food tasted the same, the coffee was just as strong, but there was a presence in the air, strength layered with kindness, a quiet defiance that told them the diner stood for more than just good meals. Months passed, and Maddie's story began to spread beyond the town's borders. News outlets picked it up, spinning it as a tale of courage and unexpected heroism. She was invited to speak at local schools, women's shelters, even a few military support centers. But she never let it change her. She'd go, speak from the heart, share her journey, then come right back to the diner before the breakfast rush. People started driving into town just to eat at the little place owned by the Navy SEAL's daughter. Some days she'd sit with strangers, share pie and stories, and listen more than she talked. Her past no longer felt like something she had to defend. It was now a part of the legacy she embraced fully. On the first anniversary of the confrontation, the town held a small ceremony. It wasn't just for Maddie. It was for everyone who'd stood with her, changed because of her, and found courage through her story. They planted a tree in the square, with a small plaque underneath. It didn't list names or titles. It simply read, "For those who stand their ground, with grace." And Maddie? She stood by the diner window that night, watching the tree swaying gently in the wind, her hand wrapped around a warm mug, the trident pin resting on her neck in a delicate chain. Her father eventually retired fully from his consulting work and moved into a little cabin just 10 minutes from town. He spent his mornings fishing and his afternoons sitting on the diner's porch, swapping stories with anyone who'd listen. Every now and then, Maddie would join him, apron still on, hair a little messy, laughter quick and easy. They didn't talk much about what had happened that night with Hawk, but when they did, they both agreed on one thing: it changed more than just one life. It woke up a town, challenged old prejudices, and reminded people that appearances could deceive, but strength had many forms. Maddie never claimed to be a hero. She wasn't trying to be anything more than who she already was. But that was exactly what made her unforgettable. She wasn't just the daughter of a Navy SEAL. She was Maddie Carter, cook, survivor, protector, and the quiet storm that no one saw coming. And that diner, with its worn stools and aging linoleum, became a place where anyone, no matter who they were or where they came from, could find warmth, truth, and a plate of pancakes made by the girl who changed everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.